That gnome is a code violation, and frankly, it lowers the tone of this entire community. Those were the first words Lacey Crane ever said to me. Standing at the end of my driveway in a coral blazer and white sneakers that had never touched dirt. She was the president of the Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association. 3 years into a tenure she treated like a coronation. And the thing lowering the tone of the community was, by her measurement, a ceramic garden gnome, 11 inches tall, holding a tiny watering can. My late wife had bought that gnome at a roadside stand the summer before she passed. It sat under the front porch rail where she had put it, and I had not moved it in 4 years. Carol had named the gnome Wendell, which she thought was hilarious. And she used to tip his little red hat with one finger every time she came up the porch steps with the mail. It cost her $3 at a folding table outside a fruit stand on the highway, and she carried it home in her lap the whole drive like it was made of glass. After she got sick, Wendell stayed on the porch because moving him felt like moving her, and after she died, moving him was out of the question. I dusted him once a week with the same rag I used on her reading glasses, which I had also not been able to put away. A man learns to keep small things exactly where the people he loved left them. It is not sentiment, or not only sentiment. It is a way of saying the house is still theirs too. So when a stranger in a coral blazer stood at the foot of my driveway and called Wendell a code violation that lowered the tone of the community, she was not insulting a lawn ornament. She was reaching across a fence line she did not understand, and putting her hand on the one thing in that yard I would not let her move. I did not tell her any of that. I have learned that the people who most need to know what a thing means are exactly the people who will use it against you. And Lacey Crane had the look of someone collecting ammunition, not understanding. What Lacey did not know, standing there pointing her pen at my porch, was that I had spent 26 years as a municipal code enforcement officer for the county 2 valleys over, and that I had read more covenant documents, zoning charters, and management agreements than she had read magazines. She saw a retiree with a soft voice and a gnome. She did not see the file boxes in my garage or the trade I had quietly carried into a second career. She did not check. People like Lacey never check. So let me ask you something, and be honest about it. If a woman you had never met walked up your own driveway and told you a keepsake from your dead wife was lowering the tone of the neighborhood, what would you have done? Would you have raised your voice? Would you have moved the gnome just to keep the peace? I did neither. I want to tell you exactly what I did instead, because it took 2 years, and at the end of it, I owned the company that wrote her rules. My name is Walt Brennan. I was 61 years old that spring, a widower, and the owner of a small outfit called Brennan Yard and Ornament that made and sold cast stone garden pieces, planters, bird baths, and yes, gnomes. I had started it as a hobby after I retired from the county, a way to keep my hands busy after Carol died, and it had grown into a real business with a warehouse, 8 employees, and a catalog that shipped across 4 states. I lived in a tan house on 1/3 of an acre in Ridgeline Pines, a development of about 200 homes pressed up against national forest land in the mountains. And I had moved there because the air was clean, and my granddaughter Nora was 20 minutes away. Nora was 15 that year. Her mother, my daughter, worked night shifts at the regional hospital, so Nora stayed with me most weeks, did her homework at my kitchen table, and walked my old yellow dog biscuit up the fire road every evening. She was the reason the house had to stay calm. She had lost her grandmother and watched her grandfather go quiet for a year. And I was not going to let a woman in a coral blazer turn our home into a war zone she had to live inside. She was a careful kid, the kind who lined up her pencils before she started and erased instead of crossing out. She had Carol's habit of humming under her breath when she concentrated. The same 3 notes over and over. And the first time I noticed it, after Carol was gone, I had to go stand in the garage for a minute. Biscuit had decided years ago that Nora belonged to him, and he followed her room to room with the patient devotion of a dog who has appointed himself a job. In the evenings, the two of them walked the fire road behind the house, up to where the pavement gave out and the national forest began. And she would come back with her cheeks red from the cold and tell me what she had seen. A deer, a hawk, once a black bear, far enough off to be exciting instead of frightening. That walk was the shape of our days. It was the thing I was protecting. Everything that came later, I measured against whether it would reach that walk. I tried the polite way first. I always tried the polite way first. When Lacey delivered her verdict about the gnome, I told her, in a level voice, that the gnome was on my private porch, behind my own railing, and that I would be glad to read whatever rule she believed it violated. She told me the rule was self-evident. I told her self-evident was not a citation. She wrote something on her clipboard, turned on her heel, and the white sneakers carried her back to a golf cart with the HOA seal stuck crooked on the hood. I stood at the top of my driveway and watched the cart whine away down the street. And I will tell you what I felt, because I think it matters. I did not feel angry. Not yet. I felt the old, familiar click of a thing sliding into a category I knew well. For 26 years, I had been the man on the other side of that conversation, the one with the clipboard and the citation. And I had learned early that the difference between a fair officer and a petty one was a single question. Did you read the rule before you enforced it? Or did you decide what you wanted and then go looking for a rule to hang it on? Lacey had decided about Wendell before she ever opened the covenant. I could see it in the way she wrote on her clipboard without checking anything. The way a person signs a receipt they have no intention of reading. That click told me this was not going to be a misunderstanding I could clear up with a friendly word over the fence. It was going to be a campaign, and campaigns are won on paper. That evening, I did what I have done after every confrontation of my adult life. I opened a fresh manila folder, wrote the date on the tab, and recorded exactly what had happened in plain sentences. Time, words spoken, who was present. Nora watched me from the table with Biscuit's head on her knee and asked what the folder was for. I told her it was for the truth, in case anyone ever needed it. She nodded like that made perfect sense, which to a 15-year-old who trusted me, it did. 3 days later, the first notice arrived. It was printed on Ridgeline Pines letterhead, and it cited my gnome as a violation of the covenant section governing yard ornamentation, with a fine of $50 and a demand for removal within 10 days. I read the covenant that night, all 40 pages of it, the way I used to read them for a living. The ornamentation section said nothing about porches. It governed the front yard setback, the visible lawn area, and it explicitly exempted anything placed under a covered porch or behind a railing. My gnome was both under cover and behind a rail. The rule that supposedly condemned it actually protected it. I wrote that back to the board in a calm 2-paragraph letter, quoting the exact subsection, and I put a copy in my folder. I did not pay the $50 because there was nothing to pay. A reasonable board would have read the subsection, recognized the error, and closed the matter. Lacey Crane was not a reasonable board. She was the board in every way that mattered, because the other 4 members had long since learned that disagreeing with her cost them more than agreeing did. What I learned over the following weeks, in pieces, was that the gnome had never really been about the gnome. Lacey's husband, Doug Crane, ran a development company called Crane Vista Builders, and Crane Vista had quietly optioned the parcel of forest edge land directly behind my street. To build the luxury cabins they wanted to build, they needed the county to vacate an old access easement that ran along the back of 6 properties. mine included. An easement is a recorded right, and a recorded right is hard to move when the people it touches are paying attention. The simplest way to move it was to make those 6 owners miserable enough to sell, or distracted enough not to notice, or compliant enough not to object when the vacation petition came up for a vote. I was one of the 6. The Gnome was the opening move. The Gnome in a campaign to teach me that resistance had a price. That is the part I want you to hold on to as I tell the rest. From very early, I understood the shape of it. The suspense in my story is not whether I won. The suspense is how a man with a folder and a quiet job beat a developer and his clipboard wife, and what it cost to do it without ever once raising my voice. The escalation came in a staircase, and I counted every step. The first step was the $50 Gnome fine, which I had refused, and which the board doubled for non-compliance at their next meeting, making it $100. That was Incident 1 in my folder. Incident 2 came on a Tuesday morning in May. A man in a polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his belt walked up my driveway and announced he was there for a compliance inspection. I asked to see his county credentials. He told me he was contracted by the association. I told him that the association had no authority to inspect the interior or the rear of a private property, only the visible front, and only for covenant matters. He photographed my porch, my side yard, and my back fence anyway, from the public sidewalk, and then, when he thought I had gone inside, from 6 feet up my driveway. I watched him from the window. I wrote down the time, the badge that was not a county badge, and the line he crossed. Incident 2. I want to describe that badge for a second, because it was the first thing that told me what I was really dealing with. A real county inspector carries a photo identification card with a seal, a number, and a department name, and he hands it to you before he asks for anything. Because he knows that authority you cannot prove is authority you do not have. This man's badge was a laminated rectangle with a gold shield printed on it and the words Ridgeline Pines Compliance. In a font somebody had picked off a menu. There was no number. There was no seal. It was the kind of thing you can order online for the price of a sandwich. And he wore it clipped to his belt at the exact height a real officer wears a real one, because the costume only has to fool people who have never seen the real thing. I had spent half my life issuing the real thing. He photographed my fence, and I photographed him photographing my fence, and neither of us said another word. And when he drove off, I noted the make of his truck and the fact that it had no county plates and no county markings, just a magnetic sign on the door that said the same 3 words as the badge. Incident 3 was a stack of fines that arrived all at once in June. A fine for the color of my mailbox, which matched the approved palette. A fine for my trash cans being visible. On the one morning a week, they were legally at the curb for pickup. A fine for unapproved landscaping, which turned out to mean the wildflowers Carol had planted along the walk a decade earlier. Each fine was $50. There were 6 of them. I read every cited subsection, and not one of them said what Lacey claimed it said. I wrote calm letters quoting the actual language, filed copies, and paid nothing, because there was nothing owed. My folder was getting thick. I bought a second folder. The day the 4th thing happened, Nora was home. It was a Thursday in July, late afternoon, golden light coming sideways through the pines, and she was on the porch doing geometry with Biscuit asleep at her feet. A flatbed truck stopped at the end of our street, and 2 men got out with a chainsaw and a clipboard. They walked to the back corner of my lot where the old easement ran, and they started marking my fence posts with orange paint. Nora came inside fast and found me in the kitchen. "Grandpa," she said, There are men spraying the back fence." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. I went out and asked the men what they were doing. They said they had been hired to clear an obstruction in a recorded right-of-way, and that the fence was coming down Monday. They showed me a work order with Crane Vista Builders printed across the top. I told them the easement was an access easement, not a clearing easement, that it gave a right to pass and not a right to demolish, and that my fence had stood inside my own boundary for 30 years. The older of the two men looked at the work order, looked at my fence, and said it was not his call. I told him I understood, and I asked for a copy of the work order, and he gave it to me. That copy went in the folder. Incident 4, and the first one that put a date on the wall, because if the fence came down Monday, I had until Monday to stop it. That weekend I made a phone call I should probably have made earlier. I called Ruth Alvarez, a woman I had worked beside for years at the county, now retired and licensed as a private land surveyor. Ruth had run more boundary lines in those mountains than anyone alive. I asked her to come survey my back line and to pull the recorded plat and the easement document from the county. She came Saturday morning with her transit and her old steel tape, and by noon she had confirmed what I already knew. My fence sat 4 feet inside my own property. The easement was a 16-foot access strip recorded in 1968 for the benefit of a logging road that no longer existed, and the language granted ingress and egress only. There was no right to clear, grade, or build. Ruth signed an affidavit on the spot, and I drove a copy to the county recorder Monday at 8 in the morning, an hour before the flatbed was due. The men came, saw the recorder's stamp on the affidavit taped to my gate, called someone, and left without touching a post. Ruth was 70 that year, and she set up her transit the way other people pour a cup of coffee without looking at her hands. She walked my back line with the steel tape paying out behind her, calling numbers over her shoulder while Nora wrote them down on a legal pad. And when she reached the corner, she stopped and tapped an iron pin half buried in the pine duff with the toe of her boot. "There's your monument," she said. "Set in 68, same year as the plat. Your fence is 4 feet inside it." She crouched and brushed the needles off the old pin so the stamped number showed, and she made me photograph it next to her tape. "People think a boundary is where the fence is," she told me. "A boundary is where the record says it is, and the record is older than anybody arguing about it." Then she pulled the easement document out of her bag, the 1968 grant, and she read the operative line aloud twice so I would hear it the way a court would. A right of ingress and egress for the purpose of access. Not a word about clearing, not a word about building. She signed her affidavit on the tailgate of her truck, pressed her license seal into it, and handed it to me like she was handing me a loaded thing, which she was. "Take that to the recorder first thing Monday," she said. "A surveyor's stamp on a recorded fact is the closest thing to bedrock you will ever hold in your hand." That was the first time I saw the pattern crack. Not break, just crack. A constrained county deputy named Sam Whitfield had rolled out that Monday because Lacey had called in a disturbance complaint against me. And Sam stood in my driveway, reading the affidavit and the easement document with his hat pushed back. He told me something I want you to hear clearly, because it matters. He said that when someone files a complaint, he has to respond every time, whether the complaint has merit or not, because that is the job. He said the way you beat a bad faith complainant is not by yelling at the deputy who shows up. It is by building a record so clean that the day the truth has to be decided, there is only one way it can go. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing, and to get every incident in front of a neutral body. Then he drove away, and I added his name and his words to the folder. Through all of this, Lacey never softened, and she never checked. At the July board meeting, which I attended and recorded with the county's blessing because it was a public association meeting. She stood at the front of the clubhouse and called my property functionally part of our managed common area, whatever the old paperwork says. Whatever the old paperwork says, I wrote that down word for word. She told the room that I was a difficult resident who refused to respect community standards, that my business was running an illegal commercial operation out of a residential home, which it was not because my warehouse was zoned commercial and sat 6 miles away, and that the board would be pursuing every available remedy. The 4 other board members looked at their hands. A woman 2 rows ahead of me, a neighbor named Diane, turned around and gave me a small, apologetic look. And I filed that look away too, because allies announce themselves quietly before they announce themselves loudly. Here's the thing I had been circling for weeks, and the thing that turned a defensive fight into something else. Every fine Lacey issued, every notice on that letterhead, every inspection by the man with the laminated badge, was generated and processed by a third-party management company. Ridgeline Pines did not write its own rules or send its own letters. It contracted that work out, the way most associations do, to a firm that drafted covenant amendments, printed violation notices, ran the fine schedule, and advised the board on what it could and could not enforce. The firm was called Summit Covenant Management. Their name was on the bottom of every document in my folder, in small gray type that nobody is supposed to read. They had written the rule book Lacey was waving at me. And one slow evening, reading that small gray type for the 100th time, I went and looked them up. Summit Covenant Management was a privately held company headquartered 1 valley over. It managed the documents and fine schedules for 31 associations across the region, including Ridgeline Pines. It was profitable, dull, and entirely dependent on its contracts. And it was, I discovered, quietly for sale. The founder had died 18 months earlier. His widow had no interest in the business, and an estate attorney was shopping it to anyone who would take the contracts and the liability off her hands. The asking number was not small, but it was not out of reach for a business owner who had spent 20 years living below his means and had a warehouse free and clear. I did not decide that night. I drove out the next week and met the estate attorney and read the books, the way I read everything, line by line. The company was sound. Its contracts were standard 1-year terms with renewal clauses, and crucially, each contract gave the management company, not the board, the authority to interpret ambiguous covenant language and to issue or rescind violation notices. The board set policy. The management company executed it, and in the gaps, the management company decided. Lacey had been borrowing that authority for 3 years without ever once reading the agreement that granted it. She thought the power was hers. The power belonged to whoever owned Summit Covenant Management. By the end of the summer, after a financing arrangement and a great deal of paperwork I kept entirely to myself, that was me. The estate attorney was a tired, decent woman named Pam, who clearly wanted the whole thing off her desk. She walked me through a conference room stacked with bankers' boxes, 31 associations worth of contracts and covenant amendments and fine schedules. And she watched me with growing curiosity as I read instead of skimmed. "Most buyers want the revenue," she said. "You're the first one who's actually reading the covenants." I told her the covenants were the asset. The revenue was just what the asset produced. I spent 3 full days in that conference room. I read every contract twice. I confirmed that 30 of the 31 associations were ordinary clients, run by ordinary volunteer boards doing their dull best, and that exactly one of them, Ridgeline Pines, had a president who treated the contract as a personal license. I read the indemnity clauses, the liability the firm carried for improperly issued notices, the clause that let the management company rescind any notice it determined was not supported by the governing document, I read the renewal terms and the termination terms. By the third day, I knew the company better than the man who had founded it. And I knew that the single most decisive sentence in the entire stack was the one that said, the management company, not the board, had the final word on what the covenant actually meant. Lacey had been standing on that sentence for 3 years, without knowing it held her up. I bought the floor out from under her, and she never heard it move. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people misunderstand. I did not buy that company to become a tyrant with a better clipboard. I bought it because the rules of Ridgeline Pines were being used as a weapon by someone who had never read them, and the cleanest way to disarm that weapon was to control the document that defined it. I kept the existing staff. I kept the other 30 associations running exactly as before, because they were not the problem. I changed almost nothing. What I changed was that, going forward, every violation notice issued in the region would actually be checked against the actual language of the actual covenant by someone who knew how to read one, including, and especially, Ridgeline Pines. The escalation did not stop while I was buying the company, because Lacey had no idea any of this was happening. Incident after incident kept landing in the folder through August and September. A certified letter threatening a lien on my home for the unpaid fines, which had now been compounded to over $2,000 on paper. A second fake inspector. A call to my business customers, 3 of whom told me a woman claiming to represent the Homeowners Association had warned them that Brennan Yard and Ornament was under legal investigation and they should reconsider their orders. That one made my jaw tight in a way the Gnome never had, because that was my employee's livelihood she was reaching for. I did not call her. I wrote it down, got 2 of the customers to put what they had been told in writing, and added it to the folder. By the end of September, the staircase had 11 counted steps, each one dated, each one filed, each one quoting a rule that did not say what she said it said. One of those customers was a garden center owner named Hal, who had bought from me for 6 years. He called me himself, embarrassed, and read me the voicemail the woman had left. And I asked him if he would write down what he had heard and sign it. And he said he would do better than that. He would keep the voicemail. The other was a landscape designer 2 counties over who had been about to place her biggest order of the year and had gotten the same call. She was angry on my behalf, in the way that decent people get angry when they realize they were nearly used as a weapon against someone they liked. And she typed up a statement that same afternoon and emailed it to me with the timestamp intact. I printed it, dated it, and filed it. I did not lose either customer. Hal placed his order anyway, a little defiantly, and the designer doubled hers. Still, I want you to understand what Lacey had done. She had picked up the phone and tried to take bread off the table of 8 people who worked in my warehouse, people who had nothing to do with a gnome or an easement, because frightening my customers was simply another tool in the box, and she did not think twice about reaching for it. The Gnome had made me careful. This made me certain. The step that crossed the line came in October. The county had finally scheduled the public hearing on Crane Vista's petition to vacate the old easement, the one that ran behind my street. If the easement was vacated, Doug Crane could build his cabins right up to the back of my fence and the 5 other fences on my row. The hearing was set for a Thursday evening at the County Administration Building, open to the public, with the Board of County Commissioners presiding. Lacey saw it as her finish line. She had spent 2 years softening up the 6 of us. And now she needed only for the commissioners to believe that the affected owners either supported the vacation or did not care enough to fight it. 2 days before the hearing, on a Tuesday night, Nora called me from the house while I was at the warehouse closing up. Her voice came in pieces. "Grandpa, there's a man in the backyard with a flashlight. He's taking the fence down. I told her to lock the back door, stay in the front room with Biscuit, and keep me on the phone. I told her not to go outside for any reason. I drove the 6 miles faster than I should have, and the whole way her voice was in my ear, small and steady and scared, telling me what she could see through the window. By the time I turned onto our street, the man was gone, and 3 of my fence posts lay on the ground with the orange paint still on them. And Nora was standing inside the front door with the dog and the phone and a face I will not forget. She was not hurt. He had never come near the house. Even so, he had come onto our land in the dark, with my granddaughter home alone. And that is the moment the story stopped being about a gnome. I have replayed that drive more times than I want to admit. The phone was on the seat beside me on speaker, and I kept my voice flat the whole way because she needed at least one calm voice in that house, and I was the only one who could give it to her. "Talk to me," I said. "Tell me what you see." "He's by the back corner," she said. "He has a light on his head." Biscuit's growling. The dog had planted himself at the back door with his hackles up, all 60 pounds of arthritic yellow loyalty, and I told her to leave him there and go to the front, and I heard her feet on the floorboards and her breath going quick. "There's a saw," she said. I heard a saw. "Lock the front door too," I said. "Sit on the couch. Do not open anything. I am 11 minutes out." I counted those 11 minutes down out loud so she would have numbers to hold instead of fear. 10, 9, 8, and somewhere around 4 she said the light was gone, and the saw had stopped, and a truck was leaving. When I came through the door, she was sitting exactly where I had told her to sit, with Biscuit's whole front end in her lap and her arms around his neck. And she looked up at me and said, in a voice trying very hard to be older than it was, "I wrote down the time, Grandpa. Like you do." I had to set my keys down very carefully on the counter so my hands would not shake, because that was the moment I understood she had been more frightened than she let me hear, and had still reached for the folder. I called Deputy Whitfield directly. Whitfield. He came that night, photographed the posts, took Nora's statement gently and briefly, and confirmed what the work order in my folder already proved. The man worked for Crane Vista, and Crane Vista had no legal right to touch that fence, because the easement was still recorded, still ingress and egress only, and still mine to defend. "Trespass and criminal mischief," Sam said, writing in his own notebook now. He told me to bring everything I had to the hearing Thursday. Everything. I told him I intended to. I did not sleep much those 2 nights. I sat at the kitchen table with both folders open, and I built the record into a single clean binder. In order, dated, every incident tied to the exact subsection it violated and the exact document that governed it. 11 covenant fines issued under language that did not support them. 1 easement the developer had no right to clear. 1 affidavit from a licensed surveyor. 1 trespass with my granddaughter in the house. And underneath all of it, in the small gray type at the bottom of every notice, the name of the company that owned the authority Lacey had been pretending was hers. I made 3 copies. Nora helped me collate them at the table, and when we finished, she asked if we were going to win. I told her the truth. I told her the deed and the dates would speak, and that all we had to do was let them. The hearing room was full. Word about the easement vacation had spread, and the 6 affected families were there. And Diane the neighbor was there in the 2nd row. And so was Doug Crane in a good suit. And so was Lacey in a magenta blazer with a folder of her own that I suspected she had never read. The chair of the commissioners opened the floor on the vacation petition. Doug's attorney spoke first, smooth and brief, describing the easement as an abandoned relic and the affected owners as supportive or indifferent. Lacey spoke second, and she could not help herself. She told the commissioners that the Homeowners Association supported the vacation, that the residents of Ridgeline Pines were behind the project, and that the lone objector, meaning me, was a difficult man running an illegal business who had racked up thousands in unpaid community fines and had no standing to be taken seriously. She actually said the fines out loud, into the record, as if they were proof of something. That was her last mistake, and I almost felt the floor tilt when she made it. When my turn came, I did not give a speech. I have watched people lose by giving speeches. I walked to the podium with the binder, and I asked the clerk to enter 3 documents into the record. The first was Ruth Alvarez's signed and recorded survey affidavit, establishing that my fence sat 4 feet inside my own boundary and that the easement was a 16-foot ingress and egress strip with no right to clear or build, recorded in 1968. The second was the deputy's incident report from Tuesday night, establishing that a Crane Vista employee had trespassed and torn down that fence in the dark 2 days before this hearing, while a minor child was alone in the home. The room made a sound when I said that, a low sound, and I let it pass without looking at anyone. The third document I handed up was the one nobody in that room expected. It was the executed purchase agreement and the recorded change of ownership for Summit Covenant Management, the firm that held the contract to interpret and enforce the Ridgeline Pines Covenant and to issue or rescind every violation notice the association sent. I asked the clerk to note the effective date, which was in August. Then I said the only pointed thing I said all night, and I said it flat, to the commissioners and not to Lacey. The thousands of dollars in fines the association president had just entered into this record as evidence of my character were issued by a management company. That company has reviewed those notices against the actual covenant language. Every one of them has been formally rescinded as improperly issued, because not one of them was supported by the document they cited. The current balance owed by my household to the association is 0. It has been 0 the entire time. The chair of the commissioners asked me to confirm that I now owned the management company. I confirmed it. She asked Lacey whether the association had verified the fines before entering them as evidence. Lacey said the fines were issued by the management company. The chair said yes, and the management company has rescinded them, and you entered them anyway. Then she set the petition aside. She did not just deny it. She referred the trespass and the fraudulent fines and the calls to my customers to the county attorney. And she noted on the record that a recorded easement cannot be vacated over the documented objection of the owners it burdens, which we plainly were, because the survey and the affidavit and the binders said so in language no one could wave away. Here is the paired arithmetic of that night, and I want you to sit with both numbers. The fines Lacey entered to prove I was a scofflaw totaled $2,100. The amount I actually owed, after the company that owns the rules read the rules, was 0. And the easement she spent 2 years trying to erase had been recorded in 1968, 57 years before she decided my gnome lowered the tone of her community. 57 years of recorded right against 24 months of clipboard. It was never close. She just never looked. The consequence fell exactly where her own actions aimed it. The easement stayed on the books, which meant Crane Vista could not build the cabins up to my fence, which meant the parcel Doug had optioned was worth a fraction of what he had paid to control it. The county attorney's referral became a real investigation into the trespass and the false statements made to my customers. Within a few months, Lacey was no longer president of the Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association. Removed by a recall, the 4 Quiet Board members finally found the nerve to call once they understood how exposed the association had become. Diane, the neighbor who had turned around to give me that small, apologetic look in July, ran for the board, and won. And one of the first things the new board did was vote to have every fine issued in the prior 3 years reviewed against the actual covenant. Most of them came off the books, not just mine. And the man who had torn down my fence in the dark with my granddaughter in the house pleaded to criminal mischief and trespass. And Crane Vista paid to rebuild every post he had pulled, and a few he had not, because the new board made the repair a condition of settling its own claims. I did not ask for that. I did not have to. The thing about letting the documents speak is that once they start, they tend to say everything that is true, not just the parts you planned. The fence went back up on a clear Saturday in late autumn, the pines already dropping needles across the line Ruth had surveyed. Nora helped me set the new posts. She was 16 by then, taller, steadier, and she tamped the gravel around each post with the back of a shovel while Biscuit lay in the cold grass and watched. When we finished, she walked to the front porch and she picked up Carol's gnome, the 11-inch one with the little watering can, and she set it back exactly where her grandmother had put it, under the rail, in the shade, where it had always been allowed to be. She did not say anything. She did not have to. I stood in the yard with the dog, and I let the whole thing settle, the 2 years of it, into the simple fact of a fence that held and a gnome that stayed. So here is the lesson, plainly the way I wish someone had handed it to me before any of this started. When someone with a little authority tells you that your property is theirs to govern, do not argue with them in the driveway. Go read the document. Read the whole covenant, every page, and find the company name in the small gray type at the bottom of the notice. Because someone wrote those rules, and someone profits from enforcing them. And that someone is rarely the person yelling at you. Get a licensed surveyor to walk your actual boundary against the actual recorded plat, and pay for the affidavit. Because a recorded fact outlives every opinion. File a public records request for the easements and covenants that touch your land before you ever need them. Keep a folder. Date everything. Put every incident in front of a neutral body that has to write down what it sees. You do not win these fights by being the loudest person in the room. You win them by being the person whose paper is older, cleaner, and true. If you have a story like this, a clipboard and a costume and a rule that turned out to be nothing, put it in the comments, because somebody reading needs to hear that it can go the other way. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, where a retired water commissioner gets a cease and desist over the irrigation ditch her grandfather dug, and the HOA finds out the hard way who actually holds the water right. Take care of your folders. I will see you next time.